All right, thank you everybody. Thank you everyone for still tuning in spite of what appears outside here, a rainy climate in Singapore weather. So I don't know. Warm welcome to everyone for the afternoon session, which is titled "The Promise of Action and Rightfulness." For the afternoon session, I am joined by four panelists, of whom two are actually artists at the Biennale, and two other who work in a more sort of curatorial research and academic domain will also speak of their ongoing research to sort of tangentially enter into the biennial discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to kind of talk a bit about how the second session is sort of premised upon. And it is, I suppose, the promise of action that builds on the biennial's faith in agency and patience. And it is perhaps a hope that the second session will reframe our understanding of the notion of change, or at the very least, the notion of progression or continuity. But often when we talk about change or progress, we ask, how do we make space for more? Um, what I'm interested today in, perhaps also throwing a provocation to the panelists, is to think about how do we also make sense of change across time. Because perhaps agency and patience evoke not only the promise of what is thought to be right, but that of different temporalities, a sort of time scale that escapes the choreography of the visible. Um, and by choreography of the visible, in this sense, it is a product of a specificity of a biennial or an exhibition duration. But it is also, as I recall, artistic director Patrick Flores's words, a sort of sudden vicinity of collaborators and objects that make things happen. Um, I suppose in reflecting my own individual and collective curatorial work for this biennial, and speaking as a Malaysian, um, I first think about Sharon Chin's work in The Skin of a Tiger, Monument to What We Want. Um, Also a work that was shared by June Yap earlier in the morning, in the earlier afternoon session. A work that perhaps is inspired by the historic change of a parliamentary power in Malaysia, and yet just within the biennial duration itself, this particular parliamentary power has been upended in a rather spectacular and messy political debacle, one that is still unfolding. So perhaps an unintended outcome in thinking about agency and patience is also one of melancholia. And this sentiment is perhaps neatly encapsulated in the keynote lecture by Latifa herself when she characterizes that what does one do when all circumstances are systematically stacked against you or us in this sense. So perhaps the notion of rightfulness in this afternoon session begins with identifying a sort of universal that rejects us, in the words of Sarah Ahmed. And perhaps the best way for us to move forward or to continue is to be unhappy actors and make unhappy objects rather than to make a promise of happiness. So I hope that with this particular introduction, that we may consider, if not recover, some of the questions, challenges, and maybe discontent that falls through the cracks of neat lifespans of biennials and exhibitions. So I'm going to introduce the speakers today in the second panel, who will explore the notions of rightfulness through their work. What I'm delighted to introduce is also the fact that the panel, their work and practice represent a very diverse range of modalities, from curatorial work to socially engaged work to sort of aesthetic and pedagogical modes of thinking about this change in confronting perhaps what we call as prohibitive institutionalities or the limitations that exist in this complex contemporary world. So I'll make just very brief introduction, but you will also see the speakers or the panelists' biography just before each of their presentation. With me today, the first speaker would be Bojana Piskur, who is a senior curator at the Museum of Modern Art in Ljubljana. Her presentation would be on her ongoing research for the Southern Constellations projects, which explores the collection of histories in former Yugoslavia. After which we will have Karula Rahim, who is an artist, one of the artists at the Singapore Biennale. He will be speaking about his project here and his work, that his practice that is primarily in assemblages and installation. So here at the Biennale, his work intimate apparitions respond to themes that are particular to the marginalizations of minority. Following that, we will have Ileana Vista, who represents Bakudapan Food Study Group, a group that she initiated in 2015 with her colleagues at the Gajah Mada University in Indonesia. What is interesting with Ilyas or Bakudapan Food Study Group is the fact that it is a collaboration with Prihat Moko Moki and Piring Terbing, and the work that is presented here takes off from a sort of pedagogical framework from a sociologist, Dr. Mamitua Saber. And tangentially, and the last speaker that I'll introduce is Sid Perez, who is a curator at the NUS Museum. Her practice or her work there focuses on programming potentials in curatorial practice. But specifically too, her entry point at this afternoon's sessions comes from perhaps a long-term collaboration with Lian Ladia, with whom she found Planting Rice in 2011. And through this, and also tangentially through Lian's research project on Colosphilia, another artist at the Biennale, she will be talking about a very recent case study of new curriculum for all questions, and a camp that is inspired by Colosphilia's Worlds in Collision curricula and also archive project. So without further ado, I would like to pass the baton to Bojana Piskur to present and share her work with us.
I don't know if you hear me, I hope you do, but I would like to thank you for the invitation. I would like to speak today about another global connection, which is the non-aligned movement, and with a specific focus on cultural politics and Yugoslavia. Okay, so I hope this works. I don't know why I couldn't reach my screen, but anyhow. So the first slide refers to Yugoslavia. In recent years, there has been a renewed interest in the idea of Yugoslavia, not only in our region, but also globally. And this interest has to do primarily with the unique Yugoslav socialism, as well as the non-aligned movement of which Yugoslavia was a key member. So the reasons for this interest are many. Dissolutions in the current global order, especially rapid neoliberal globalization, which has created huge problems, the inequality, the rise of new forms of economic and political dependency, the rise of right-wing politics and fascism, and so on. So we can also say that the changes in Eastern Europe after 1989, wars in the 90s, and disintegration of Yugoslavia put history again in the center of attention, and in particular, local histories are being revised. So please, image 2. Can I have the second image, please? Yes, thank you. Socialist Yugoslavia was established in 1945, so that's after the Second World War. In 1948, it broke the relations with the Soviet Union and was left isolated as a consequence from the Eastern Bloc, which led to significant changes in Yugoslav political, economic, and cultural sphere. But Yugoslav political machinery realized really early on that the opposing the two Cold War blocs, so that balancing the two opposing Cold War blocs would actually be a better guarantor of security than would membership in one of the blocs. So consequently, the policy of peaceful coexistence became a new international orientation, and Yugoslavia started to align itself predominantly with Global South. Next image. Yugoslavia was also one of the key members in the non-aligned movement, and non-aligned movement was a coalition of small and middle-sized states, mostly former colonies and developing countries from the Global South. Formed in 1961 at the Belgrade Summit with 25 participating countries, and had grown to almost 100 members in 1979 at the organization's peak. The non-aligned movement represented, at least until mid-80s, a significant rupture on the global level, an attempt of an alternative mondialization and a desire to create a more just, equal, and peaceful world order. It was, in its essence, an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, anti-racist movement, a third way between two blocs. And Yugoslavia was a special case in this constellation because it helped bringing non-colonial Europe into the grouping. Next image, please. Art and culture played an important role in the non-aligned movement, even though comparatively little is known about this today. And I think one of the main reasons being is that after the Second World War, the main orientation in arts and culture in many non-aligned, decolonized, newly independent countries, as well as in Yugoslavia, was primarily the one following the Western epistemic canon, and the other non-Western story, which comprised of various provincialized modernisms. And here I'm following the well-known Dipesh Chakrabarty's argument about provincial stories, where he says there is no universal history, but many provincial ones. The same can be said for modernism. So this kind of non-Western story propagated ideas that were often in line with similar issues that the non-aligned addressed. Such were, for example, if we look from the 60s on, the questions of cultural imperialism and cultural equality. That's in particular the 1960s non-aligned declarations. And then the 70s declarations focused on restitution and epistemic colonialism, and the 80s specifically on cultural heritage and its preservation, as well as cooperation in culture between the non-aligned members. So non-aligned cultural politics from the beginning specifically encouraged cultural diversity and cultural hybridity. Western European cultural heritage was to be understood in terms of juxtaposition. So this heritage would be interwoven with and into the living culture of the colonized and would not simply be repeated under new political circumstances. And for this reason, cross-national appreciation for cultural heritages and local-to-local approach was extremely important. And this is the argument that also Vijay Prashad writes about in his book, The Darker Nation. And Yugoslavia might be a good case study for this cultural dilemma, because on one hand, Western canons were widely accepted in the art circles, and in the other, non-Western ones were politically stimulated through various cultural policies linked to the non-aligned movement. But in reality, those, say, other modernisms and art expressions were never of significant consideration in Yugoslav society, and nor were they part of museological deliberation. We can even say they were kind of stimulated without a deeper understanding of what other modernisms really meant, as it's clear from reports, text, and concrete museological cases of that era. However, there were exceptions to that, mainly in architecture, urbanism, but also with the establishment of some new collections, institutions, and exhibitions. So I would ask for the next slide. All these deliberations that I just mentioned were part of the exhibition Southern Constellations that I curated last year in Moderna Galleria. The exhibition was a result of almost 10-year research on the non-aligned movement, more specifically on its cultural politics and the role art and culture play within the movement. So the works, 26 cases that I call them from around the world presented in the exhibition, they dealt not only with the past, that is researching, interpreting various historical constellations, such as organizations, events, exhibitions, cultural exchanges, but also looked into and examined the present time with the question, could there be a non-aligned contemporaneity? And if so, what would it be like? So I'll be talking now about some of the topics about this cultural misunderstanding, let me put it this way, through the perspective of research projects that were part of the Southern Constellation exhibition. So next image, please. Yeah, you cannot see it really well, but just to give the idea, that is the cartography of Yugoslavia's cultural exchanges with the non-aligned countries. As you can see from this image, there were many exchanges, very rich exchanges. To relate to these exchanges in Yugoslavia, there was a special committee established after the Second World War, and this was called the Committee for Cultural Relations with Foreign Countries. And this committee arranged exhibitions outside Yugoslavia's borders. So cultural conventions and programs of cultural cooperation included not only Western, Eastern Europe, but also non-aligned countries, and they touched on all levels of cultural production. Next image, please. One such case is the exhibition of Yugoslav contemporary prints, which was sent as this kind of a cultural cooperation project, first to Uruguay in 1976, and then it traveled to Chile, to Peru, to Bolivia, to Venezuela, and Mexico. It traveled for 3 years, included works of 47 artists and 91 works. Yugoslavia has signed agreements with 56 non-aligned members and observers. But in addition to all these exchanges, there were, between the 1960s and 1980s, also many new biennials that opened throughout the non-aligned world, and this biennial signifying a kind of different cultural exchange. And if I mention just some of them, Biennial of Graphic Arts in Ljubljana, Triennial India, New Delhi, Koteher Art Biennial in Colombia, Asian Art Biennial in Bangladesh, Biennial of Arab Art in Baghdad, Havana Biennial, and others. Next image, please. So, as I mentioned before, Yugoslavia had special relations with the newly independent countries in Africa and Asia already from the late 1950s on. And President Tito often traveled to those countries on so-called journeys of peace. Particularly significant was his 1961 trip to Western Africa, and this is just before the first meeting of the non-aligned. He traveled on a boat called Seagull, not as a conqueror, of course, but to support the independence of post-colonial states. And this red line on the map signified his 61 trip. So please, next slide. These travels, of course, acquired a strong economic dimension too, and created new spheres of interest and exchanges among countries of the non-aligned movement. So in this image, you can see one of such economic thing, and it's in Zambia. You can see on the image President Tito in the right corner and Zambian President Kaunda. So economic collaboration at first included Yugoslav construction companies working on projects in Africa and Middle East, and those were the companies that sprung up as a consequence of fast urbanization of Yugoslavia after the Second World War. The largest one was Energoproje, construction company from Belgrade that operated in over 50 countries around the world, designing and building infrastructure like hydropower plants, irrigation system, electricity networks. and buildings like conference halls, office building, and hotels. Next image. And this is one such case that you can see here. This is Lagos International Trade Fair in Nigeria, where Yugoslav architects combined, say, specific Yugoslav modernism with tropical modernism and the local context. So it can be added that this way Yugoslavia also successfully propagated its ideology and culture globally on the basis on the formula specific Yugoslav modernisms, which were still based on Western canons, plus a very unique Yugoslav socialism equals emancipatory politics. And it was also at the same time, of course, an attempt to show the world how it's possible to direct one's own modernization processes. Exchanges of all sorts also happened in the fields of arts and education. Many students from non-aligned countries came to study in Yugoslavia. Museums acquired various artifacts, and some institutions even opened anew. So please, next images. There are 4 images related to the Museum of African Art, which opened in Belgrade in 1977 as a result of this ideological and political climate. And this first image shows Zdravko Pečar on the right side, together with Franz Fanon and Omar Usedik. And Zdravko Pečar and his wife Veda were diplomats and journalists in Africa, and they were supporting also various liberation movements there, like National Liberation Front in Algeria, but they were also the collectors of works, and this huge collection that they have was then is a basis for the collection of Museum of African Art. Can you please put the next 3 images? This is the entrance to the Museum of African Art. And the next one, please. This is the exhibition display that's been like that since 1977. And the last one is the way we presented Museum of African Art at our exhibition in Ljubljana. So the Museum of African Art, as I said, is a typical case. Even though the predominant discourse of the time of its establishment was anti-colonial, the methodologies and procedures were almost completely adopted from similar institutions in the West. And interestingly, this is probably the only, if not the only, anti-colonial museum of African art in Europe. Next couple images, please. The earliest example is probably the founding of International Exhibition of Graphic Prints in Ljubljana, which is that time Yugoslavia, already in 1955. And this is the Moderna Galleria museum where I work. The main person behind was a director of Moderna Galleria at that time, Zoran Kržišnik. And the purpose of founding this biennial was to pave the way for establishing contacts worldwide and to prove that even, as he put it, art can be an instrument of liberalization. And if you can put some of the images, this one and maybe the next one. So the idea was to invite artists from all the countries with which Yugoslavia had cultural or political relations, and the Biennial of Graphic Art was to be a practical example of Yugoslavia's cultural diplomacy and the cultural policy of the non-aligned movement. And as a result, this biennial exhibited basically everything, the whole world. But the biennial's approach towards acquiring works for the exhibition was twofold. So on one hand, there was a jury. They were mainly art critics and curators from the West, like Pierre Estany, Harald Zeman, but there was also Jorge Glusberg from Buenos Aires. And then the other, the invitation was sent to some countries directly, mostly countries from the global South, to present whatever they wanted without any interference in their selection. So next image, please. And then the next one also. And then you can see that's the 1989 participation, and the orange color signifies participants from non-aligned countries and the yellow from the observer countries. So we can say that Ljubljana Biennial of Graphic Arts was one of the first non-block art events at the time of the Cold War division, putting forward a model for peaceful coexistence of the first, second, and third worlds, if only in art and culture. Next image. Yes. In 1984, Josip Broz Tito Gallery for the Art of the Non-Aligned Countries was inaugurated in the city of Titograd. Now it's called Podgorica, Yugoslavia. It was the only art institution established directly under the auspices of the non-aligned movement. And there was a document adopted at the 8th summit in Harare, Zimbabwe, a couple of years later, where this gallery was to become a common institution for all the non-aligned countries. The activities of this gallery were many. So besides collecting works from the non-aligned countries, they also organized exhibitions, symposia, residencies. They produced publication and also documentary films. And works from this collection were shown around the world, in Harare, in Lusaka, in Dar es Salaam. They were shown in Delhi, Cairo, and many other places. Unfortunately, their aim to create a triennial of art from the non-aligned countries never realized because of the wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. But this collection was also, at that time, in the 80s, never quite understood, was not well understood. In some prominent Yugoslav art historians saw this collection as comprised of works of not affirmed artists from faraway exotic places, or they put it works from authoritarian states that support official art. And it's true that the gallery was a political project from the beginning, and the acquired works were not always the most representative works of particular artists, but maybe in the next slide, this is from our exhibition in Ljubljana, but some of the names of this over 1,000 donated works are, for example, from Sri Lanka, Iromi Vijayawardena, from Bangladesh, Rafiqul Nabi, Hassan Kwamrul, from Philippines, there is Etzel Moscoso, from India, Suresh Sharma, and many, many others. So, but on the other hand, this collection's potential to challenge the ways the Western art operates and produces hegemonic narratives and canons was not particularly well understood in Yugoslavia either. Unlike Western colonial museums of the past, the gallery in Titograd acquired art of the world solely in the forms of gifts and donations, while attempting to develop its own cultural networks and frameworks of knowledge, and to combine this with experiences from other parts of the non-aligned world. The gallery ceased to exist in 1995, and the collection is now part of the Contemporary Art Center of Montenegro. So these are only a few of the examples from Yugoslavia that were directly linked to the non-aligned cultural politics. It can nevertheless be concluded that while Yugoslav political manifestos of that time espoused the grand ideas of anti-colonialism, decolonization, and struggle against cultural imperialism, the practice tended to be different, and it took quite a while before art of the world was discussed in terms of cultural and intellectual decolonization, cosmopolitanism, internationalism, parallel and local art histories, local histories in the sphere of art and culture. But if you look in the wider context, the non-aligned transnational network did not produce a common tissue that would create a new international narrative in art. Western canon might have been challenged to some degree, but with the exception of few cases, non-Western cultural expressions were usually interpreted in the frame of ethnology, traditional arts and crafts, or as pre-modern and underdeveloped. And the last image, please. That's a very interesting example of ICA International Critic Association meeting, the first meeting of this ICA in Kinshasa in Zaire in 1973. So I was saying that non-Western cultural expressions were usually interpreted in frame of ethnology, or as pre-modern underdeveloped. And to a large extent, this was a sign of the times as well, because it seemed logical and unproblematic that a certain cultural space, the Western one, should feel entitled to judge all other cultures by its own measure according to its that is, Western rules and standards. But so what did happen with the non-aligned network was this potential to think with a difference and to create different histories, different modernism, arts, narratives that extended beyond the Eurocentric ones. And this way, also rejecting the idea of universalist modernism and linear development in art, there obviously existed a very heterogenic artistic production, a variety of cultural politics, extensive cultural networks, which enrich the cultural landscape of the non-aligned and enable discussion about the meaning of art outside the Western canon. And this is something also that I tried briefly to emphasize in this presentation, of course, but the question remains: what were actually the real consequences of those progressive, even emancipatory cultural politics and cultural heritage? How they affected the development of new or different prototypes of art institutions, networks, epistemologies of knowledge that we have today, and what to learn or extract from these ideals, what kind of future strategies for creating a different kind of international constellation in the field of culture. So with these questions, I will end this presentation. Thank you very much.
Of a sort of a very condensed sharing of the continuity of this historiograph of the non-aligned movement, but also in how the collection is that source of that history and also a potential sort of activation of thinking of these alternative political models as well in contemporary times. So the next speaker would be Rahim, and as I mentioned earlier, Kairullah has a work, Intimate Apparitions at the Gilman Barracks, as part of the Singapore Biennale. He will be speaking more, not just about the work, but also about the communities that he's worked with in the process of the making of this project itself. I'll like to invite Kairullah.
Hello, am I on? Okay. Hello Z, thank you so much for having me as part of the panel for the symposium. Maybe just a very quick introduction to myself. I am Kairullah Rahim. I am an artist here. I was trained in the field of painting, but I think since the past few years, I've also sort of like adapted different forms of art making in my practice. So for the symposium session today, I will be sharing a lot about maybe perhaps the ideas behind my work for the Singapore Biennale titled Intimate Apparitions. I will also elaborate a bit on the communities that I engaged in for this work. So I will just begin with my slides. Okay, so for the Singapore Biennale, the work that I presented is titled Intimate Apparitions. And what I was interested in is pretty much still very in line with what I have been researching and working with for the past few years. I think Z has mentioned that I am very interested in presenting stories of communities. In many instances, these are also marginalized communities. When I was invited for the Singapore Biennale, I was thinking of perhaps if I could revisit some of the older works that I have done in the past, but also sort of like present them within a more ambitious scale. So I will just, okay. So the work consists of two aspects. One is Intimate Apparitions, which is basically a series of assemblages, and the other component of the work is Intimate Appreciation Sightings, which is a room with presenting photographs that shows, I guess previously with the installation, I was focusing more on the objects to sort of like signify or symbolize the bodies that occupy these spaces, whereas the rooms with photograph, I actually collaborated with another artist, Taufik Rahman, and we were particularly interested in perhaps also maybe giving a bit more presence of the body, because in the installation I decided quite consciously that I did not want to like use the bodies to talk about these communities, whereas for the photographs I was actually quite open to like perhaps think about different ways of like presenting communities without showing explicitly some of these communities. So the first community that basically there are 4 communities that I work with for the installation, for the project. The first one that I would like to talk about is basically communities of gay men, okay, gay men who cruises. So perhaps to give a bit of context and idea for people who are not familiar with what cruising is basically the act of searching for a sexual partner, and in most instances these sexual encounters are casual or like a one-off thing. So this reminds me back to 2017 when I was in Taipei. I was doing a residency at the Taipei Artist Village. I remember when I was there, like I think it was actually my first night there, and I could recall I was in the park. This was close to midnight, and I did not know like which park this was exactly. But I think through my familiarity with this culture of cruising, I sort of like could picked out like some of these activities that were going on. So what I did was I actually texted a friend immediately and asked, like, by any chance, is this the infamous cruising park in Taiwan? And true enough, this is the cruising park in Taiwan. So this is the 228 Peace Memorial Park. This is located in Taipei. I think precisely also like why I would like to share this some of these images, because I think people have more often than not have a very different idea of what cruising may look like. So I think by showing some of these images, people could have an idea of actual cruising activities. So the cruising activity takes place in the park. So there, the park is quite big. There are different sections of the park, and this is basically like a pagoda, which is located in the middle of the park. I was quite surprised because I've never really experienced or witnessed gay men cruising in such open areas and so public. So this was quite a new thing for me. I think I will mention a bit more about cruising in Singapore in a bit. Also, people think that because it happens at night, there's always like a very discreet nature. Yes, I think there it does happen within a very discreet premise in terms of I mean, especially because of like safety and also like safety from policemen. But in many instances, even though they are discreet, but they're not really hidden. Many of these activities or cruising activities actually happen in the open. However, I guess perhaps someone with a more attuned eye, or what they call now the gaydar, would probably be able to pick up some of these very coded signifiers. Yeah, so this was the fountain just beside the pagoda at the 228 Peace Memorial Park. So when I was there, like when I discovered about the park, I decided to like research more on the park, and I discovered that there was actually a very famous, in fact, Taiwan's first gay-themed novel titled Crystal Boys. This was a novel by Pai Xianyou. And I actually used the premises of the story from the novel to sort of like navigate around the park, because there were a lot of very explicit details of where and how to navigate around the park um, 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 for gay men. So this was a still shot from a TV series. I think in the 80s they actually made like a TV series based on the novel. So I actually used um, the TV series as a kind of like way for me to navigate around the park, because I completely have no sense of bearing with the park. So this is where I decided to like study the park, observe the park, and sort of like use a lot of these observations into my works. And you will realize later on that a lot of all these observations and ways and acts of seeing are actually being employed in the manner of how I work. So even things like, for instance, like for this scene, I was very interested with this frame, because the white speck at the back, I think at one glance, it's very easy to assume it's the moon, but it's actually coming off from a lamppost. So I think that some of these things could also be seen in the works later on. I will show you. So this was the work that I created in during the residency. It's titled "The Still Praying Mantis." This was because I think one of the senior gay men, I mean, within the story of Crystal Boys, the character in the novel, he was using a lot of these kung fu sort of like references to like name some of this younger gay men. So there was a scene when he was naming the gay men as like insects and birds and whatnot. So like I was very interested in even all those things. So if you look closely into the work, a lot of these objects were taken from the site itself, or also from ready-made objects that were inspired from the surroundings that I sort of like pick up from the cruising park. So you will see things like the reflective road signs, which is the two yellow spec things. You will also see there's all these orange balls, because when I was there, I think it was just a nice coincidence. It was just after the gay pride, so there were a lot of all these decorative pieces of like objects from the festivals that I sort of like pick up and incorporate them into the work. So coming back to Singapore, I decided to look into more about cruising sites in Singapore. Again, like I mentioned, I think a lot of people have a very different idea of what cruising is, especially because it's tied with very explicit sexual acts. But I think during my research, I discovered that a lot of these spaces are actually very accessible spaces to everyone. So one of it is, of course, Hong Lim Park. I think during the late 50s and early 60s, it was a very happening, or say a very active cruising site for a lot of gay men. So it was very interesting for me to discover this, because obviously now it is no longer like this, but I could draw a lot of similarities even with the cruising sites right now. So right now, I think a lot of people or other gay men would be familiar of cruising sites such as swimming pools, or even like public parks. I think these things are quite known within the gay community here in Singapore. Yeah. So this is also a cruising site, which is located in Singapore. I think it's quite bizarre. I think even when I first stumbled upon this the site, it was quite interesting, because it's not something that I would think it wouldn't be a conventional place for people to get intimate, I would guess. But for gay men, I think this I'm not sure, but I think from my understanding, it is a very fine line between something that is very much fantasized or fetishized, but also this is a kind of like make do, because we do not have like spaces. Like obviously, it's very difficult for a lot of gay men to bring their partners home because this could be due to reasons like living with their family, or they their families could not may not be as open as they wish, and all those things. But what was also interesting is also, like, I think some of the more visual cues that I picked up from here. Like, I think that there's a lot of sense of masculinity within spaces like this. We have like all this fitness corner, and it sort of like reminded me of like a gym, but like instead of being located within like a regular gym, but this is like in the forest. I thought this is something quite bizarre for me. Yeah. So for the work that I presented in the Biennale, I think all of you would have noticed by now that in the central placement there was a canoe that is embellished with all these rhinestones, and also I've added some sort of like shrubs and like greeneries as part of it. So this is in a response to the actual site of the of where this cruising activity takes place. So I sort of like pick up all those things and I put them together, and then yeah, it was just like that. Yeah. So obviously, like again, back to where it started. Like I was very interested in all these stories of marginalization of communities. I think it's very interesting because people don't realize. I think because in Singapore there's the Section 377A. Although the government officials have countlessly said that it is not something that they enforce, but I think there were already a few incidents where the government has enforced or not enforced 377A, but anti-gay acts have been have happened in the past. So this is one of the communities that I was interested in. Yeah. And the second community that I sort of was quite interested in was actually the cricketers at Chinese Garden. So again, I am very much inspired by my daily observations. This happened, I think, on one of the casual train rides in Singapore, where I actually passed by Chinese Garden and I noticed people literally coming out from the bushes, and I was like, what is going on here? So that was when I realized, oh, there's actually a makeshift cricket pitch, which is located in between Chinese Garden and Chinese Garden train station. And then I sort of like spend more time to like look into them, and a project that I did in 2015, I believe, called Next Sunday, looks into some of these poetic notions or intimate notions of how these parks are being utilized by these communities. So when I interacted with them, I sort of like got to know them quite a bit. Many of them are aged between, I think, early 20s to like even mid 40s. So majority of them are actually migrant workers from India, namely Tamil Nadu. And I sort of like use some of this again, this intels that I managed to draw out from the from this group, and sort of like employ them into the works, and then bringing back the sculpture. Bringing them back to the site and sort of like document the works there. So for the work that I did in intimate apparitions, it is a development from where I left in 2015. So I actually interacted with a team of cricketers in Chinese Garden. And I again sort of like use some of those visual cues that I picked up from them. So specifically, I could mention just by looking at these photographs, I was very drawn into the bright colors and the material of the dry fit material of their jerseys. and I sort of like incorporated them into the work, and not just those things, but also what I learned was many of these teams, they have the team names are actually quite interesting, because they all have a very sort of like a very innocent quality to a lot of these names. So some of them are like brothers, some are like friend. Like for this team in particular, like the name of the team is Friends, and we have Tamil Brothers and Brotherhood. I remember some of those team names, and I was like, oh, look, these are quite very very cute, innocent quality, and not something what we would anticipate coming from like a cricket team. So hence I sort of like try to incorporate them into the work, where I actually included all these stencils of like those stars and whatnot. Yeah. And even, I mean, if you look at the heliconia plant that a motif that I selected for the work, it was made from cricket bats that I collected from them, but I sort of like manipulated and reconfigured them into this new form, which is of a heliconia plant. So the reason why I chose heliconia plant is because it is a very common plant that could be found all around the public in Singapore, but especially in Chinese garden, I remember seeing like there's a whole bunch of them, and I was very intrigued by that. I think like this is a nice way to sort of like hint of like something which is very everyday, I guess. Yeah. So this was also, I mean, this is a photograph that was included in the room with photographs. Again, I was very interested in the idea of the vast, expansive space. So I was thinking of other ways, like are there other ways for me to like depict like a vast space instead of using the ground actually? Then I don't know, like it was like a very natural thing for me to just use the cloud as the backdrop for the images. Yeah. And speaking of parks and also like the ground and like spaces, now I would like to speak about the third community that I engaged in. So the third community that I engaged with, they were the domestic helpers. Again, very similar to the migrant workers who play cricket every Sunday. These domestic helpers, they get their days off during the weekends, and usually on Sundays they actually go out and meet. However, for this group, specifically, what I was very interested is also like how time was also very precious to them. From what I gathered, during the day they would volunteer at IMH, and then afternoon they will go to church, and following that they will head to the parks and gather with friends, and then sometimes they could also go to like 2 or 3 different parks just to like meet up with like various friends. And speaking with them, I immediately thought of the idea of beauty, because I think this is something that a lot of us take for granted. But after speaking with the domestic helpers, I remember one of them said to me that, do you know, Kai, that Sunday is very special to us, not just because we get to rest, but also this is the day, this is the one day where we get to go all out in terms of like grooming ourselves and like beautifying ourselves. And I think this is a very powerful tool for these communities, especially for them, because like I said earlier, many of us would not be able to relate to this, because I think many of us take this for granted. But for these communities, like hanging out with friends, you know, being able to wear beautify themselves, I think all those things are quite interesting. This is a photograph that I discovered. I think I probably saw this around the same time when I noticed the migrant workers playing cricket, but these are probably the domestic helpers and their friends. So what happened was, like when I was on the train, after I saw the whole thing at the park, I saw all these pockets of like people gathering under
I think something is tapping or clicking from your microphone.
Okay.
There's a clicking sound.
Is it?
Yeah. Yes, it's much better now. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's my hands probably. Okay. So like I observed this, and I thought this was very interesting because not only were they occupying like a very odd space under the bridge, but what I noticed was they specifically occupy the space that is being shaded by the MRT track. So these were just some documentations of those gatherings. Yeah, but again, just like any of the previous communities that I spoke about, um, beyond the joyful or innocent demeanor of these activities, I think it also speak about the lack of space for these communities. Um, this is also, I feel, a kind of like I wouldn't say like kind of, but this is a survival strategy for many of these communities because they have to um, do this, right? I mean, um, uh, going out with friends. I think these are just little things that a lot of us take for granted, but for them, this is a very empowering act. Yeah. Yeah. Again, these are just again some other photographs that I managed to document during my free time. This is also in Chinese Garden, but I have a feeling many of us would be familiar by now that many of these gatherings do not take place only at Chinese Garden. They take place all around Singapore. Um, yeah. So going back to the Singapore Biennale piece, why I was interested in using those flower casts, I think if we all look closely, and I think many of us actually overlooked that piece, they were actually made from casts from jelly. So which is like a common dessert that they bring around during picnic. And I was very interested in this because again, the idea of eating food on the ground. I think this is something that I could also relate with. I think with my family, looking at some of these communities, it sort of like reminded me back even to my own heritage or my own background. Yeah. So these are the ladies that I interacted with. So sometimes every first Sunday of every month, or was it the last Sunday of every month, they would actually gather and they will have all these fun games session. Yeah. So yeah, these are just some of the things that I sort of I documented for the Biennale piece. Yeah, I'll just have a quick run through. And going to I mean, speaking again about ideas of beauty. Now comes to the last community that I would like to speak about, which is the drag community. So what I did was I actually spoke to several drag queens in Singapore, and I spoke to them about this idea that I had for the Singapore Biennale, where I was telling them I wanted to perhaps shed some light into some of the issues faced by them. And one thing that I learned was, again, the idea of space is so relatable to them because as mentioned by one of the drag queens, um, being technically artists themselves, they do not get the same access to funding, for instance, to studio spaces. And many of them actually have to work from home. And this is also only if they have the luxury of the support from their family. But as we all know, um, many of these families that they come from are still very conservative. So not only their costumes and props have to be hidden at home, but even sometimes they do not have the space to like get ready for drag. And from what I learned, they actually would go to their friend's house, and they would all gather and they all would get ready to together. The drag queen that I work with specifically for the Biennale piece, for the media preview, what I found out was, because she lived quite near my place. When I told her like let's meet at this time before we head to the venue of the exhibition, she told me to meet me at the community center, and I was like, why are we meeting at the community center? And she said it's because that's where she always gets ready whenever she wants to go out and perform. So when I met her, she was still putting on her makeup at the community center bathroom, and I found this actually quite strange because I never knew the situation was as such. Yeah. So this was the photo shoot. Again, I was very interested in the idea of home because I think many of us, our home, we relate it or we think of it as spaces to for us to be ourselves or to rest. But for these communities, they do not have that luxury. So, yep. Yeah. So with that, I think I will end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. Thank you for sharing the almost radical sort of spatial capacities and potentials in sort of containing different publics. I think from Ljubljana we can see that the museum space as a public space, but from your presentation, the idea of gardens and public parks can also be a sort of also contain the sort of potential to agitate and expand what we imagine as public. So the last session, with the last panelist, we have Ileana Vista as a representative from the Bakudapan Food Group, who will be speaking a little more about the project at the Biennale, but also how in their practice, the group's practice, food is a means to perhaps or an instrument to examine issues such as migration, displacement, and also the formation of cultural minorities. So Ilia, please, I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. Thanks also for who's attending this panel via online. So maybe I'll go with the so it's anyone can see my screen. So yeah, first maybe I want to briefly explanation about Bakudapan. This is like a food study group, like it's a collective which is consists from the members from mostly it's coming from the anthropology background. So we want to do research starting with food, using food as a start point to see another issues, and also using the ethnography research and then anthropology methods, and also crossing with arts. So what we do is like cross-reference through the research, and then we also push ourselves to write as a one of the result that can be extend longer than other like forms of exhibition or workshop or something, and also can be circulated better than.
Sorry, Ilia. Could you
yeah.
perhaps put your presentation on full screen?
Okay. So yeah, this is wait a moment. Yeah. Is it working now? Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I just give also image of the members. It's like by coincidentally all the women, but we are not on the purpose that the member all is a women. And then we also wants to emphasize that our ideology is like using food as an instrument to speak broader issues such as economy, class, gender, social, politics, art, philosophy, and everything. And then we usually, like, as a form of aesthetic form, we using meeting, eating, like a kind of activities related with food, also shopping to the market. We have a performative lunch and dinner. It's to questioning, to problematizing, and then also to discussing about art, food relates with other issues. So of course this is also kind of a question, like how come this can be seen as well as a very everyday practice, but we also take it as a form of aesthetic form. So when we do it, we also do it with full of a critical approach about the issues. For example, about where the ingredients come from. What about the cultural minority using this recipe, or so on. So, excuse me. Can the Sam can operate operate my slide? Can I ask for help for operate my slide? Yeah, we go to the, I think we can go to the third slide. Yeah, so like I also want to in this panel, I want to emphasize, to highlight what's the Bakudapan practice, to see the food. I will propose as with a tree of some project with the three kind of idea. First is like a food as an identity and belonging, and then the second, food as a something that we usually taken for granted, and then also the third is food as a lens to view inequality in politics, economy, and cultural powers in the world. So I start with our project before as a food as identity and belonging. So food choice is like any other cultural expression and practice. Uh, it shows how to present ourselves, shape our identity, define our cultural membership, and express our distance from the other identities. So this picture is, I take it, it's taken from the Taipei main station in Taipei. So before we had a research project in Taipei. It's we want to do a project about Indonesian migrant workers. And next slide, please. Sorry, why? Yeah, so in this project, firstly, we want to see the situation amongst Indonesian workers who's working there, and then how, because there is so many news how miserable they are working there, but actually it's not really about bad situation, but also how they can express themselves as a migrant workers, and then it's including what happens, what kind of knowledge that share that they can get it, and they can also share amongst themselves and also among the employees. So, and then when we was there, we see food as a social glue. Like every weekend, we see in the Taipei main station so many Indonesian workers gathering, and then they bring food. It's of course this is a food from Indonesia, like Indonesian food, like a homemade, and then they cook before, and then they sharing like, oh, today I will bring this kind of dishes, and then other can also bring another, so they can exchange about food. And then it's also show how strong food relates with the homeland, with their identity. And then also we gathering the stories about how it's happened, about how your diet happened. You have to working as like taking care of old people usually in Taipei, and then some of the, of course, mostly the stories about how they're really longing for food, but it cannot like a freedomly they cook everyday Indonesian food. It's relates with the power in the kitchen as well. uh, and then uh, and then continuing with doing this kind of interview. And then we also found even the one that it's really strong for us, it's how somehow Indonesian migrant worker get forced to eat a pork. So as a majority Muslim, the migrant Indonesian migrant workers, um, uh, who's come to Taipei is yeah, majority is like a Muslim. So it's a forbidden for them, for the Muslim. Of course, this is like depends on the person, but yeah, and it's still like many cases that happened, that they being forced to consume it. This is like a very subtle situation when they only provide the food that provided every day by the employees is a pork. So there is no other option other than you have to buy by yourself, which is this is in the economical reason it doesn't make sense maybe. And then also you have to go out from the house, which is also hard for them to do that. So we call it this project 26 slides 4, because this is there was the first case going to the court about this. It's on the 26th of April. So there is a NGO working with the migrant workers to yeah, to sue the employees about this case. And then next slide, please. And then yeah, we talk about this issue. We created some of like a performative lunch. Also, we collaborate with the one of the theater companies there to create such of narrative stories. We invite people from that usually come for art events, and also we invite some of the Indonesian migrant workers and people who's working in NGO, and also some public, but this is not like lots of public because this is very limited seat. And then we talk about this, about how the lack of cultural knowledge between, like of course Indonesian is like the mostly migrant workers from Indonesia is going to Taiwan and Hong Kong, and other it's Saudi Arabia, but also we have like the majority of Taipei workers is from domestic worker is from Indonesia. But then how this kind of cultural lack of understanding it still can be happen. And yeah, of course this is not the changing whole the situation, all the law and everything, but it suddenly, but I think by we keep talking it, by we sharing from the audience that possible for us, this is the way that we want to do it. And then the next slide, please. So also, other than identity and belonging, we also usually always seeing food as something that taken for granted. Like why it's like every day our mother is usually who prepare food, and actually it's we want to see it from a very everyday practice, and then of course we want to go to the broader like how the patriarchal culture is still uh, manifest in many of our daily life. So yeah, so we have some also several workshop. It's the form, it's like a workshop doing like a cooking, doing also eating together, and also like a drawing, like a mapping what about our habits in the kitchen, our family habit in the kitchen, and then it's coming from the very our own family to see it like in the bigger picture of uh, of our like a patriarchy culture. Next slide, please. So we also doing this activities to talk about this, to problematizing about the kitchen, because some of participants even asking why we have to like this is something that why we have to talk about this, that for some people it's maybe not so important to 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 reveal about the situation. So we have like a kitchen mapping workshop that we invite the participants to draw their layout of the kitchen, and then we one by one we starting to tell about what's a habit. For example, this is really interesting for us when we see in Chinese. We did this project in Penang before, and then how in the Chinese background family, they always have a round table, and while in a Melayu background family, they have a like a square, and then fathers is mostly have a sitting in the end of the like to see the center of the tables. And then also in another culture they have like the father have the biggest glass, and yeah, it's so many that really somehow we just see there is no problem on it, but then when we looking back, it's really show us how the patriarchy culture, and then the also the terms of labor of love by the female, by either it's a mother, daughter, grandmother, aunties. It's also operates in everyday life. And can we go to the next slide? And then another workshop that also relates with the kitchen. It's we doing the workshop of grinding the dish. It's called it sambal. It's Indonesian. I think it's also well known in Asia, Southeast Asia. This is like a chili paste that mostly accompany us in every lunch or dinner. And then how to make it, it's like we using a mortar and pestle, and somehow in this modern life we using kind of blender or food processor. And then we want to see it how this kind of knowledge in that we got maybe from our parents, and then it's not considered as a knowledge just because it's something that it's just for cooking or something that happened in the kitchen. And then we start to problematizing this through the kitchen debate that happened during the exhibition of the kitchen in the Russia, and then how it's like American has a pavilion to show about the modern kitchen, and then how woman it's become have a free time of they daily job, because American products it's now it's become modern, it's easier to operate and don't waste your time, something like that. But also how they commodify like a woman's world, woman in the kitchen mostly. And then even when I say woman worlds in the kitchen, this is like show how this kind of mindset it's just like really hard to take it off. So using this kind of workshop, we try to we start with the provocative question, like how we can unpack our knowledge about cooking. And then also when you consider this as a knowledge, how come if you know how to do the mortar and pestle, and then how you cannot do it anymore. And then it's also questioning us since when we able to do it, and from whose. Also we remember during the era and our parents, when the blender or food processor just arrived, maybe they have to read the manual how to operate it. But we now in our generation, it's just like we feel like, oh, we know already, but we never consider where the knowledge is come from. Either the same as well with the mortar and pestle, because we show our parents doing, our mother mostly doing this. And then but for example, when someone from different culture, like a Western people participate our workshop, it's really for us the gesture of doing it, it's really kind of different. So this is how our activities to questioning about that about the issues around food that usually it's taken for granted. And then the next slide. This is about the workshop I explained before. And then we bring this question before we start to doing the workshop. And then after that we eating together from the dish that we made, from the sambal we made. And then we talk about all the things that we want to examine. And then next, this is when it happened. And then the participant, it's we want to participate mix between male and female as well. Next slide. And then the last thing in this panel, of course, this is still like the spectrum. We believe that the spectrum to talk about through food about all the issues around the world is still very, very broad. But in this panel, I want to also, this is the last that we will emphasize, is about food as a lens to view inequality in political, economic, and cultural powers in the world. So we started this project about the famine, the hunger during the communist demolish in Indonesia in the 65 to 67, I think, the critical moment. Of course, this is also a part of the Cold War effect that at that time Indonesian like tend to like there is a one big party, communist party. It's and then it's Indonesia almost tend to be like a socialist communist country, and then like any others country, I think that's also happened. And then there is a coup d'etat, and then I think some of the people already know that in the 65 it's a big like a massacre or tragedy for the communist communist how you call it, like if you are suspect as a communist, and then also they goes to the prison, to the camp. And then some of them, the ex victim of political prison, they're still alive. And then we started to know about, wants to know about how the situation relates to food supply at that time. And then of course this is like very bad. And then they also give us the idea about eating plants, that everything that grows in the camp, and also everything alive, like they eat rats, snakes, and everything. So, but also for us, it's interesting how to see edible wheat, because and then this is something that also in the past generation is not considered as a food. This is also, we see how the agricultural violence also happened. I think this is also part of when the colonialism in Indonesia, like when the Dutch occupation, still how they shape what is for plantation, what is the agriculture product should be, something like that. And then this is of course now what in my generation that we know about food, it's only what they sell in the market. So we studied this is edible wheat, and then this is bring us to the history of the for example law and agriculture, and then it's how it's the agrarian law, and then how this country wants to do reform agraria, but it's failed, and then it's because the political shifting. So we interested in how political shift also have affected in what we eat today, because this is all the policy about the agriculture, about the trading, about the anything about the source and material extraction, about the, for example, the palm oil policy and everything. So we started from this, from the political prisons, female political prisons. We want to see, and then what's happened in the bigger picture of food policy. And also we working, try to not only working in the regional or in the scale of Indonesia, because it's also relates with another through the regional, even the global situations, to see this kind of food politics. Can I go to the next slide? Yeah, so we arrive in the notion of how the neolib also together with the government doing this kind of the exploitation, and this is happen, I think, in the many, mostly in the global south country. And then we also want to see, like now we try to working on the issue of climate injustice. And then it's not the climate change for us. I think that the proper language for us is like injustice, because a climate change for us seems like really embrace of this situation. It's embrace from the North America and European situation, while in here, like we in a global south country is get affected by the like for example the people in the Europe try to change their diet for not eating meat, because this kind of cattle industry is the one that make it the global warming is the biggest one, and then they start to change change the diet through soya, for example. But then what happens with the soya plantation, which is happen in the countries another who supply in the European in the center, it's coming from the global south, and then we have to change our agriculture to fulfill their need. So for us, it's a more reliable to talk with the climate injustice, which is also have an impact from the global situation of climate change. And yeah, this is and what we want to do is like this is not a unique happen in just only like a country of Indonesia, or in the Indonesia and Malaysia, for example, is the one that the biggest production of palm oil. But also it's happened in somewhere maybe in Mexico or in Bolivia or in Bangladesh, that I think that we have to understand. It's like how this pattern it's happened, and then it seems like we are separate by the region, by the locate, but actually it's important to bring the solidarity between us that had the impact of climate injustice. And I think I'll go to the last slide. So to propose this panel with the promise of action and rightfulness, I think for us it's we want to constantly using our practice as a critical approach, using the aesthetic, ethics, and politics of food. And yeah, from the moment when it's come from the as a raw material until how it's produced, distribute and consume, and even to be as a leftover. So yeah, I think this is the last my slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilya, and thank you so much as well, all the other panelists. I mean, firstly, I'm really surprised that 2 hours just whizzed by. But it's also a clear indication that the expanse of the methodologies, the topics, and the subject matters that are sort of discussed today across all the panelists is just so expansive that it's quite difficult to neatly categorize or even summarize that in the next 5 minutes or so. But I really appreciate the sort of generosity, the precision, and also in many ways the sharing being quite candid in outlining some of the challenges, but also the scope of the methodologies used in each of the projects, and how each project or each presentation really inhabits a plethora of spaces, from the museum space of the collection to the public parks and cruising sites, to a sort of university and a university museum, in thinking about pedagogy, to perhaps the private spaces of the dining table. But what is clear is also how each of these projects and presentations are clearly driven by an agency. On the one hand, how the different presentation unpacks that layers of agency, individual, collective, institutional as well. But the strongest strand that I see tying all the projects is how it is informed by a sort of urgency to remember, an urgency of remembering something that is at risk of being forgotten, or stories from the margin. So I have a question, very quick one, and I hope that we can kind of have a bit of a cross discussion here. Is a question that could go two ways, perhaps for Bojana and Sid to reflect on some of the challenges within your role, situated in an institution, a museum, and also a university, in sort of reaching outwards into sort of shaping a kind of culture or community in thinking of history and thinking about pedagogy. And similarly for Kai and Ilya to perhaps share very quickly how your work is informed by your own experiences and observations that come from very private, intimate spaces, and taking this into making them sort of public concerns. Yeah, how do you feel about those roles in perhaps bridging the private and the public, and vice versa?
Should I go first? Okay.
Sure.
So thank you for the question. I think it's an important question to ask, especially because we are a public institution, the main institution for modern contemporary art in Slovenia. But we've been dealing very actively with this question at least a decade and a half, and more recently also within the Confederation of Museums called Internazionale, that the Bart's Museum Mahka is also part of. And that's a deliberation on the question of constituencies. What are our constituencies? What does a constituency mean in a contemporary situation? So with other words, constituencies are our partners that can be either social movements, NGOs, artistic organizations, collectives, and so on, and how to work with these constituencies in kind of horizontal way. So that's something that we've been doing for quite some time, also in practice, of course, but also these ideas from the non-aligned, this where I was just presenting this kind of attempt on a different kind of networking. Maybe this can be used for deliberation as well, maybe for future deliberations on constituencies, future museum networks, also not only in our part of the world, but also globally. So I think in this way we are thinking and doing.
I think it's quite interesting that Ljubljana identified the constituencies, and we begin to think about how perhaps institutions, or what are this kind of civic spaces that we feel responsible for. And perhaps I'm going to speak for myself, and somehow my learnings, being part of NUS Museum, how it constantly thinks about its role within an academic, an academic umbrella, and who then do you speak to, while reckoning with the institutional history of starting from a teaching collection, for instance, and that changes as well because of the factors of what the university demands. Hence, it's like a state mandate several times removed or filtered towards us. But in terms of in terms of placing it, or at least trying to situate what we could do within the institution, maybe I'm or trying to kind of reach outward, I almost think about what we can do through them. Perhaps it's not always like with or against, or sometimes it's also sideways, what's para-institutional work that we could do. And this notion of lessons as well, and how there are thoughts or ideas, bureaucratic ideas, about treating or relegating art, as a to sit or fit within the frames of how you teach. And you can start thinking about that, how art should be taught. Really, is it taught in, what are the institutional models? So those are the things that we kind of constantly reckon with. So that was also something that I was trying to propose. What are the different pedagogic functions? That art is not just a mere extension of the classroom. You know, the museum is not just an extension of the classroom where you could just put everybody in and we can talk about it like in the museum space. What else can we offer? And in the sense for new curriculum for old questions, we think about all of these proximities as well. That's why these people like Fangze, Phoebe, you know, they're working within some capacity as academicians, but then they have other lives. There are things that are parallel practices. Likewise with students that we encourage and organizations that we encourage to be part of this camp, to think about, you know, it's not about taking or withholding or withdrawing from your sole purpose as a student in a university or as a professional in a university, but then how can you somehow lead all of these parallel modes of sharing, transmitting knowledge and understanding things. So that is my answer to that.
Is it me?
Sure. I mean, Ilya or Kai, I think it's sort of perhaps a movement, not necessarily in opposition to what Boyana and Sid has shared, but it is a sort of more a motivation or an impulse that comes first from a very intimate private space, and then taking these into a sort of more public presentation, or even expanding the space for people to appreciate these matters to a different sort of public. So I was just wondering, like, what are your reflections in that, you know, thinking about also back to the title of it being like the promise of action and rightfulness.
Who's going first?
Yes.
Kai.
Okay. I think after hearing Ilya's presentation, I think just like even within the work that I presented for the Biennale, there are already a lot of parallels that I could draw from these things, and I think a lot of it is pretty much again taking from all this lived experience, or even like what Sid briefly mentioned about, you know, proximity. I think a lot of these things that we see around us, I think sometimes, or rather more often than not, it's not very different from what from I would say, like, from comparing it to my own personal life. I think I have already shared with you I think briefly that as much as these are stories of communities that I do not identify with, I think this is also somehow an extension of some of my struggles, my personal struggles with my own identity. I think look, I mean, listening to Ilya's presentation, I can't help but to agree that there are so many parallels there. There are so many things that I think even we ourselves are still unpacking and trying to, like, make sense. Yeah. I would say, yeah, I think that's all.
Nice. Okay, thank you. Should I go next? Yeah, I think from our me, myself, and also as a collective experience, how to bring it this from the very private, very private kind of notion, like it's happened in the kitchen, in a very personal kitchen, to bring into the public. It's somehow, it's also of course it's challenging for us, and then we usually doing the format of this is also what we've been questioning a lot, because mostly our format is kind of a gathering, or like eating together, and then it's really hard to get a broader audience. Like, it's not like what we had in the Singapore Biennale, for example, for the exhibition in the White Cube or museum, is not really often happen to us. It's not really like what our core practice. But our more core practice is like by doing together with the participant, and then it's also very limited. And also this is somehow, of course, we are not so popular as as like doing this, because in the same time when there is so many using food as a kind of celebration, like talking about like cultural things, looking for the authenticity, we are going to other direction that problematizing about this. So yeah, in our experience, so that's why we need to write things. We also have a two publication already, like book, to sharing more, because we understand how limit the event, its limit by the time and also by the participant who's attending. So yeah, maybe this is also what's our challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, those are like really cogent points, and maybe with that, I'd like to kind of end with perhaps a happier note, and sort of to thank all the speakers today, given we are also running out of time, I suppose, and a sense that what I'm getting, in spite of the vastness of the approaches and the practices, is a commitment that the promise of action and rightfulness perhaps lies in the commitment to be able to cross over different sort of modalities, but also different sort of publics, and not to imagine that one only occupies a very specific role within the work that we do, whether it's individual work or social work or an institutional work. And in that sense, I suppose that also resonates with one of the conceptual sort of curatorial thinking of the hyphenate figure that is quite prominently featured in this biennial. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for sharing your afternoon with us, all the sort of audiences that are out there online tuning in. Thank you so much. And in case you still have not had a chance to check out the keynote lecture by Latifa. She talks about militant memory and the freedom project of Salud Al-Ghabre, the very sort of key figure that inspired the title of this edition's biennial, Every Step in the Right Direction. But also Jalal Taufik's sort of podcast or recording of his discussion on radical closures. So all are very topical, timely discussion in this viral times. With that, I would like to thank everyone and close this afternoon's symposium. So thank you very much. Thank you again, Boyana. Thank you, Kai, Sid, and Ilya.